Um, all right, so I hit record.
Was it an
I,
electrical fire, or how did it happen?
well, they're still investigating. So it's thought perhaps because he was kind of, like I said, he was stubborn and refused help. So he did work on his trailer on him by himself, and he would injure himself
Mm.
sometimes and refuse medical attention. And he would use like weird chemicals like acetone on cuts. And so
Oh.
one suspicion is that perhaps he was doing that and accidentally set a fire
Mm-hmm.
because he was near the stove or something, and then um, he just wasn't able to get away from it. But yeah, I appreciate condolences. Yeah, uh,
93.
yeah.
You did it.
My dad's biological father, my grandfather died at 92 just last year in November. Yeah, after I had moved him and his wife, my step grandmother, to the Rogue Valley.
Yeah.
I'd been here for 6 months and he passed away. Well, he didn't even pass away. He wanted to die. He elected to go into hospice and like withered away for 2 weeks, basically. Um,
Mm.
yeah, so it's been a difficult past year and a half or so in terms of death and so forth. But uh, this is philosophically relevant and interesting. One of the things that we'll talk about, and we can address this today, but we'll confront it explicitly in coming weeks, is the relationship between death and individuation or personal identity. Uh, so I get the sense, and this is reflected in my late grandfather's change in attitude and personality and so forth. It's like when you get at a certain point approaching death, you become something strange that nobody else can really understand. And that can become quite isolating. And some philosophers, and this is the case for Hegel, whom we'll talk about next week, but also a little bit more recently in the 20th century, Martin Heidegger, another major existentialist philosopher, argued that um, one is born into a community of relationships. And we talked about that in the context of Socrates at the beginning of the course. One is always already, for example, in a relation with one's parents, with one's mother, and the various social assignments that extend in their broader network and so forth. But as we age, all of the points of those individuals with whom we stand in relation in this overarching network tend to disappear. And then in the end, we're left as the solitary, isolated point in our confrontation of death, which becomes our own most and greatest possibility that can't be outstripped. Right? So death is the insuperable limit beyond which no one can see, and no one can stand in for you in your own death. No one can even understand what it means to approach death. Not as an actuality that we'd care not to think about right now. It's always something later, but as an always looming possibility that remains in any case implicitly in the background. Um, but of course, as one approaches an age like 93, that possibility becomes ever more forceful and shrill, you might say. Uh, and so to connect this to philosophy, how we relate to that own most possibility, which no one else can stand in. It's really, uh, death can be understood in that sense as the possibility of the impossibility of being, which is perhaps the wall that our thought breaks apart when it hits, right? To think the possibility of the impossibility of our own existence, but how we grapple with that, how we take it seriously, and how we allow that to put the time that we have in this world into relief plays a considerable and essential role in the ongoing construction and perdurance of ourself, of who we are and how we relate to ourselves and others, and nurture these relationships and so forth. Um, yeah, okay. Yeah, so for this week, we're going to get into the idea of no self. So that perhaps in connection with what we were just talking about, that's a different way of thinking the possibility of the impossibility of being, at least insofar as we're considering being or identity or selfhood as a unitary, continuous phenomenon with which we're always familiar. That's something that Hume calls into question, and we'll continue to look at that as well from the angle of a different intellectual tradition. Buddhism, we'll talk about on Thursday, it made an impact on Hume. He was an 18th century Scottish philosopher, but he had been exposed to at least some of the major sutras in the Mahayana tradition, in his travels and so forth. But he certainly appropriates the insight from this Buddhistic conception of self as illusory into the familiar language and vernacular and systematic structure of Western philosophy. So it'll be interesting to examine this question and this problem from two robustly different sources. Okay, so are there any questions or comments about anything before we get going? We do have to talk just a little bit more about Descartes. So I asked you at the end of last week to consider some issues with the argument that I distilled from the second meditation. But before we jump back into that, does anyone have any comments or questions about anything? So you did, so you guys turned in a reflection paper Sunday, or it was due. I hope to read through all of those and provide some feedback by the end of this weekend. And then of course, looking ahead to next week, we have the midterm paper coming up. But with that in mind for next week, I eliminated the quiz and also the discussion forum. So there's none of that, so you can have some more time to spend focusing on the paper project. All right, any questions or comments? Okay, so I'll ask you once I share the screen. So I'll share the screen and jump back into the presentation from last Thursday, more or less where we left off. And hopefully you guys spent a little bit of time over the weekend and these past few days to consider how you might respond to this particular problem. So this is the argument that we can essentially distill from what we got out of the two meditations, especially the second meditation. So my body has the property that I doubt it. My mind, as we have seen, does not have the property that I doubt it. Because remember to say, I as mind do not exist, or I as mind, or I doubt that I as mind exist, is in the very same expression to affirm the very thing you're denying, right? So that means that the mind has this ineliminable quality or property to it, such that it cannot be doubted. And that's what Descartes uses to distinguish it as a radical, that is fundamentally discrete order of being, in contrast to what we find in physical nature. And so this is the principle of the identity of indiscernibles, taken from Leibniz, a more or less, again, contemporary of Descartes. If two things are identical, then that means they have to share all qualities or properties in common. And then Descartes concludes, mind and body are separate substances, hence his famous dualism or substance dualism. So I asked if this was a good argument, and to cut to the chase, I called attention to the fact that we're dealing with a formal argument in deductive logic, which means, since it's a formal product of what we call natural deduction in the sphere of philosophical logic, that means that we could, and I didn't really demonstrate this here because it's not necessary, but we could take all of the terms, so all of the determinate content that are found to populate the various premises that lead to a conclusion, we could take all of that and translate it into a purely symbolic language that resembles in many ways the language of mathematics, right? So that's what you would study if you took a course with one of my great colleagues and friends, Dr. Devorah Shapiro, who teaches logic. Um, so then you should, if it's a valid argument, a valid deductive argument, you should in principle be able to replace the content of the argument with anything else. And if it's valid, the structure should guarantee the truth of the conclusion. But here we saw that if we replace the language of Descartes' argument with something else, a problem seems to arise because these premises do not guarantee the truth of the conclusion. It turns out to be an invalid argument, which means since validity is an attribute of the formal structure of a logical series of propositions that lead to a conclusion, then that means that Descartes' argument that he gave us in the second meditation is invalid, right? So where does this argument go wrong, specifically with the H2O in water? And then how can we use that insight to make sense of where Descartes' argument in particular went astray? Does anyone have ideas about that?
Could the difference be that we know that H2O and water are the same substance? So that could put into question if the body and mind are separate substances?
Yeah, so we have a special empirical knowledge, at least, of the identity of H2O and water. But what is that? So I think that's a good place to start. But what does that knowledge as empirical or objective knowledge entail? Or what does it point to? What is it knowledge of? Well, it's knowledge of these external phenomena in the world, namely a chemical compound that we label H2O and some substance that we call water. And we find that the difference is only linguistic, it's only conceptual. That is, the difference issues from our own subjective orientation, but we're really talking about something objective and external in the world, right? So that's the problem, right? So if someone came up to you and presented you this particular argument, like right now, leaving aside all of the philosophical subtlety, what do you think you would say to them? If someone in a good faith way, they weren't being facetious or messing with you, if they presented this line of reasoning, like what might you tell them? I mean, beyond the assertion that we just considered that, well, obviously H2O and water are the same, how would you correct them?
I would start by kind of like the Hume kind of talked about like how our mind creates like an idea around an object, and it's just our mind's perception. It's not actually the object. We can't actually know the object, just our perception of the object. And so when we perceive water, we think of a liquid substance. But of course, water can vary. Is there mud in the water? What minerals are associated with water? Is there chlorine? There's like so many things we associate with the word water. The H2O is hydrogen and oxygen together. So H2O is more, I guess, imperative of the truth of water, while water is variable to whatever container it is in, whatever application we're using it for, its environment and its constructs and its constituents. So they're different in the way that our mind gives meaning to water, and the water could be very different than what our mind gives to it. There may be like parasites in our, like there's so many things that water can be, while H2O is hydrogen and oxygen. Of course, there could be variation in the ratios of those two elements, but it is more of a simplistic kind of thing.
Okay. So yeah, there seems to be a matter of distinction when it comes to our interpretive relationship to these things, right? And so that's where the error appears to emerge. But you might say, more simplistically, and that might be the best strategy given the kind of argument we're dealing with here, given that it's so obviously flawed, right? You might say, well, pointing to the first sentence, pointing to the first premise, you might say, is this property, namely doubt, is that a property of H2O?
No.
Or what is it a property of?
His perception.
Exactly. It's a property of the speaker's thinking. It's a property of the speaker's mind and language, right? Similarly, we find the same in premise 2. Water does not have the property that I doubt it. Well, doubt, again, is not a quality that we would attribute even to water as a substance or phenomenon that is familiar in our ordinary experience, unlike H2O. If there were doubt or isn't doubt, as this case portrays, well, that doubt has nothing to do with the object of the sentence. Rather, it has to do with the speaker of the sentence. In other words, the subject. Yet, what do you find in the fourth sentence, namely the conclusion? There's no more reference. There's no more verbal gesture towards the self, towards the I, towards the subject. All of the information pushed here has to do with the objects under consideration. So then, if we understand the principle of validity as a formal principle in the system of deductive logic, if we understand that principle to mean that given a series of premises that are, for the sake of argument, taken to be true, then the conclusion is guaranteed to be true in itself as a matter of formal necessity. And that entails, that requires, in fact, that the content that we encounter in the sentence of the conclusion is already available in some way in the content of the premises, right? So it's illegitimate to smuggle new information into the conclusion that's not already given in the premises. But there's a fundamental disparity or disconnect in this argument between the language of the premises and the language of the conclusion. Namely, and this is to use some technical vocabulary, commentators and scholars have pointed out critically that the language of the premises is describable in the terms of intensive discourse, whereas the language of the conclusion is characterized by extensive discourse. So what is the difference between intensive and extensive discourse? Well, think of discourse here as a kind of set, right? A bracketed set that contains a particular series of propositions, or perhaps even just one proposition. So the set here, the discourse that we find in the first two premises, is intensive because it points within itself, namely the self here being the mind of the speaker. So cue or clue words that tell us that here we're dealing with intensive discourse would be the reflexive pronoun of I, first of all, and then also the psychological language of doubt, right? So that tells us that what's going on in the first two sentences, these first two premises, is the speaker's own psychological self-description. What he's really talking about here is his own attitudinal relationship to the object under consideration. He's not talking about the object itself, yet when you get to the conclusion, he's no longer talking intensively about his own thinking, his own experience, his own attitude in relation to an object. He is purporting to make a knowledge claim about this object itself, or these objects themselves, independently of his mind. So then, because this is the argument at issue, we can go back to it in this way. So in other words, in the first two premises, Descartes says, body is a property that I doubt it. That's intentional discourse. He's talking about his doubt, not his body. In the second premise, my mind does not have the property that I doubt it. Again, he's referring to an attitudinal relation, intensively, psychologically, not objectively to some phenomenon or substance that we call the mind. But then the intentional language is abandoned. The self-referential language is removed and replaced with perfectly objective extensional discourse in the conclusion, where now the speaker thinks he's able to say something objectively certain about these phenomena independently of his own experience in relationship to them. That is, he's making a knowledge claim about mind, the very nature of mind, and about body, the very nature of materiality as such. And on the basis only of intentional terms that bear out his own relationship to these things, he's making claims about them, right? So in other words, you would tell the person who thinks that H2O and water are not the same thing because that person doubts H2O but doesn't doubt water, you would tell them, well, it doesn't really fucking matter what you think or doubt about this substance. That isn't sufficient to change the nature of these substances or really to tell you anything essential about them. So we could leverage the same charge against Descartes in this kind of argument. Does that make sense? So we could say, just because you doubt your body, that doesn't really tell you anything about the essential nature of bodily existence as such, independently of your experience of doubt, right? Does that make sense? Any questions, or does that need more clarification, or what do you guys think?
Oh, I kind of got it as we went on, but yeah, you kind of just substituted his argument with water, and therefore using deductive reasoning, it doesn't make any sense if you replace it with another something.
Yeah,
So
it makes sense, but the issue is, formally speaking, as a technical criterion, it fails the test of validity, right? So a classic example of a deductive argument that would be valid is the following. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal, right? So notice in that argument, I didn't even have to supply the conclusion for you. If I tell you all men are mortal and then Socrates is a man, you would be able to tell me yourself, oh, so that means Socrates is mortal. That's because the information that makes up or makes possible the conclusion is already provided in the premises. Yet that's not the case with an argument like this, because the arguer has perhaps obliviously, that is not intentionally, introduced terms that are not present in the premises to the conclusion, thereby rendering it invalid. In the same way that would happen if I were to alter the conclusion of the example argument I just used and say, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal and he's ugly. That is true. Socrates was famously quite physically repulsive. He admitted it himself in many dialogues. It's a matter of some philosophical significance, actually. But the truth of that sentence isn't sufficient to ground the necessary inferential connection between the premises and the conclusion, because in the premises, I never said anything about Socrates' appearance, right? So that's sufficient as a problematic introduction to the conclusion to render the entire argument itself invalid.
yeah, it makes perfect sense.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. So now that's a problematic argument. And this, in fact, was presented to Descartes. He was made aware of this and he conceded the point. But importantly, in meditation 6, which I didn't ask you to read, which is the final meditation of the work, in which he brings the foregoing arguments that have to do with substantiating mind-body dualism and also proving via unaided reason alone the existence of God. He comes up with this argument. So premise 1, every material body is spatially extended. So the language in the second meditation about extension was possibly confusing when you were reading this. But we talked a little bit about it last time. So to be extended, like the ball of wax, before it's melted and after it is brought to the fire and transformed, is precisely identical insofar as it is material, and as material, regardless of its superficial appearance, from our subjective experience of it, is precisely unchangeable in being extended, right? So when I say that all material or physical objects have the essential quality or attribute of extension, that just means that they occupy some determinate measure of space and exclude other bodies from that volume of space. So for example, this coffee cup is an extended thing. And for that reason, I can measure it in all sorts of ways. And the modes of the extension are quite different, right? So one quality of this extended object would be the tactile characteristic of its smoothness, which I can feel haptically, that is, with the sensation of touch. It also has the visual property or quality of being dark in color or black, right? So there are all these qualities that I attribute to the thing, and those qualities, like we saw in the case of the ball of wax, can change over time, either subtly or quite dramatically. Yet what remains the same, despite all of these changes or possible changes, is the identity of the wax as material, which is as ultimately extended, right? And so because this is an extended thing which occupies some determinate measure of space, it also excludes other objects from it. Hence we get this quality or principle of numerical identity, right? So this is a thing with its own identity, which we would exclude from the cell phone, another material thing, occupying its own measure of space, which cannot be inhabited by another, right? So that's what it means to say that every material body is spatially extended. Now the second premise, this is a mathematical truth. Every spatially extended thing is divisible. So this coffee cup occupies space. That is to say, it is extended in its presence in space, excluding other bodies from it. And I can measure the extent to which it occupies space, and more precisely, the modes in which this occupational presence is unfolded in time. And I can divide it up, right? So I could get out, once I finish drinking this, a pair of scissors, right? I could cut the coffee cup in half and measure these two pieces, which now come to stand as their own identities. And then I could take one of those halves and cut that in half, and then I could take that and cut that in half, and then I could take that and cut that in half, in principle to infinity, right? So in abstract mathematical principle, every material substance is infinitely divisible. But he notes, and this connects to Hume's argument, so this is one basic presupposition that philosophers have had since the advent of modernity in the 17th century, under the work of figures like Descartes, that mind or self is fundamentally uniform or simple. That is, it has a kind of simplicity. So that's what Hume means by that. The self, unlike this coffee cup, which isn't necessarily simple, because I can, for example, remove the top and reduce it to 2 rather than 1, or expand it rather to 2 instead of 1. It doesn't seem possible to do that sort of thing with mind. So I might accidentally cut my finger off, yet my identity remains untouched. My selfhood is unchanged in any ultimately truly transformative or significant sense. But so my body, similar to this coffee cup, as a material substance that is extended, that is occupying some space, my mind is not like that. I can't divide up my mind in the way that my body can be divided. And so also think about other qualities that we attribute to physical objects. So I can ask you, for example, how much does this coffee cup weigh, right? Or what color is this coffee cup? Or how does a coffee cup smell? But now think of attributes or products of thinking or of mind understood by Descartes to be the self. It no longer makes any sense if I pose a question like, how much does the mind weigh? Or what color is that thought you just had? Or how does your emotional reaction to this morning's event smell? those questions are meaningless, right? They don't make any sense. 20th century American philosopher Gilbert Ryle identified those questions as examples of category mistakes, right? Because mind and its products, so thoughts, don't seem to be the kind of phenomena or objects that can take on legitimately those qualities or attributes of weight or size or volume or color or smell or whatever. So in that sense, mind is not divisible. And so again, drawing on this principle of the identity of indiscernibles, for two things to be identical, they must share all properties in common. We can conclude, again, that mind and body are separate substances. So what do you guys think of this argument?
Seems like a very valid argument in my mind. I guess it really depends on, when you think of the word mind, if you think of your thoughts rather than your brain, or the other way around, right? Because your brain is material substance that is divisible.
Exactly, right. So
But
it would make sense to ask, how much does your brain weigh? And of course, scientists can give a perfectly sensible and easy answer to that question. But if I ask you, how much does your mind weigh? You might think, well, is he asking about the brain? But not necessarily, right? So from the point of view of Cartesian metaphysics, I am precisely not asking about the weight of the brain. So this is an issue that we talked about last time, right? Now it could be the case, and Descartes in some sense would concede this as well, that however distinct the brain is as a phenomenon from the mind, it might in any case bear a necessary relationship to the mind. So Descartes recognized, as a kind of physician of sorts, he was interested in medicine. He conducted some rather disturbing experiments on animals, unfortunately. But he would recognize, as he did, that in the case of traumatic brain injury, we sometimes find a concomitant or corresponding change in one's psychological makeup, in one's personality, that is, in one's self. So even a rationalist and dualist like Descartes can recognize that there's some strange relationship between mind and brain, but even if there is a necessary relationship, that doesn't mean it's a sufficient relationship. So even if brain plays a major central role in the ongoing construction and possibility of mind and its various products, that doesn't mean that only brain or brain alone is responsible for the possibility and actuality of mind and mental states. And so it's another move altogether to make the strong claim of mind-brain identity or identitarianism. And so there are so-called neurophilosophers, people like Paul and Patricia Churchland, so this married couple who are rather strange people. They have weird like hot tub parties, supposedly, and they raise their children to not speak in any folk psychological language. So instead of saying, I want a sandwich, I'm hungry, the children were raised to say things like, my synapses are firing, duh, 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 duh. So they are, they're called, the Churchlands are known as eliminative materialists. So they eliminate any spooky mind language. But that's not necessarily an uncontroversial view, right? So yeah, so then if we're clear about what we mean by mind, and we separate that from anything physical, including the physical organ of the brain, well then I think you're right, Noel, that this is a valid argument. It passes the test of validity in a way that the previous argument doesn't. Because notice that there's no intentional language or discourse going on in the premises. It's all about material bodies, not my doubting or thinking about material bodies or mind. And the same is concluded in the inferential move from premise to conclusion itself, right? So it is a valid argument, right? But, so in that sense, it's a good argument. But you could, of course, because validity isn't the only way an argument, even a deductive one, can go wrong. So for example, think of this argument. The moon is made of cheese. All cheese is delicious. Therefore, the moon is delicious. That's a valid argument. It doesn't mean that you should accept it. It doesn't mean that it ought to be considered persuasive, right? And why? Because even if the premises seem to guarantee the truth of the conclusion, we still might say, well, those premises are false, right? So we could say the same thing here. So we might call attention to some problematic features of the premises. So we might say, even if, taken as a devil's advocate sort of initial go at this critically, that even if the premises guarantee the truth of the conclusion, we might suspect that at least one significant premise is false. And if that's true, then we don't need to accept the truth of the conclusion. So is there any premise here that you might be suspicious of?
The only premise that comes to mind is number 3, because I agree with 1 and 2 in that any material substance is extendable and divisible. So really it all comes down to, my mind at least, the mind and whether or not it is divisible.
Good. Yeah, and for those familiar with the post-Freudian psychological or psychoaffective landscape and research and so forth, you would perhaps almost immediately come to be suspicious of that third premise. Isn't it Freud who pointed out the compartmentalized mind, whose strange structure actually makes it such that for the individual subject, in contrast to Descartes' conceit, the individual subject doesn't really know themselves, right? Because the self is made up mostly of what Freud calls the unconscious, or the id, which falls below the level of thetic, egoic self-consciousness or self-awareness. And so in terms of the relationship between ego and subconscious or unconscious and id, it's like the tip of the iceberg with the rest that remains below the surface, inaccessible for our experience and observation. So you might challenge the third premise on grounds similar to that. But then Descartes, I think, could still sensibly reply to that criticism. Well, you're using the notion of divisibility quite differently. However compartmentalized the mind might be, it's still not divisible in the same way that a physical object is. It still doesn't make sense to talk about cutting your mind into 3 pieces, or weighing your mind, or smelling your mind, right? So there are still these categorical distinctions to be kept in mind, or to be observed as significant. Right?
Do something?
Yeah, go ahead.
One thing that I was thinking about the whole time you're talking about this are twins or triplets and stuff like that, specifically identical twins. That's kind of a good example, because in that situation, they even can develop like almost entirely identically and everything. But at the same time, I mean, I've met a lot of twins and triplets in my life that are identical, and they're entirely different people. I think it's a valid argument that you can grow up out of like essentially the same thing with roughly all properties in common and still be different.
Yeah, but what then would be the source of difference in those cases?
I want to say the mind. I'm not sure how that would probably develop through, like, to connect to Hume a little bit, like an empirical sense, which is kind of the nature versus nurture argument, but like that can influence the distinction between people outside of like a purely physical property based sense.
Yeah, so something like experience over time. And it's experience over time, especially as you mentioned, from a Humean kind of empiricist perspective, that constitutes, even if illusory, this notion of selfhood or personal identity, and also then as a means by which to separate or distinguish oneself from others, even those who appear to be quite similar, such as in the instance of identical twins or something like that, right? So this is something we talked about last time too, in the weird transporter error problem from Star Trek Next Generation, where Riker was actually duplicated, and it's not clear what the original is or the copy, because there really isn't one. It's just that the stream of the particles that made up Riker was kind of split into two, yet over time, over the span of like 7 years, the two Rikers, although at the moment of production and splitting were identical in every respect, they became quite different. And also, Liam, in connection to your point, their difference was not just in terms of a physical property, such that they are different bodies occupying different space, such that they could look at each other and interact, but the difference is more inward or interior. They had different personalities, which rubbed them the wrong way, right? So good. Any other thoughts on this? But so another problem, and this is something we don't need to spend time on because we really already have at length. However satisfying Descartes' response to this criticism is, he still doesn't have a good answer for the mind-body problem, right? So even if we accept the validity and soundness of this argument, that is to say, we accept it as formally valid with true premises. So even if we think, well, even premise 3 is true. So if we accept this as a perfectly sound and persuasive argument, the question remains, how is it that an immaterial substance like a soul can stand in any kind of significant relationship, any kind of formative or productive relationship with a physical body, right? So again, if I say my soul is in my body, at least while I'm living, in is a spatial preposition. Yet, as we see here in the terms of this argument, the soul is not definable in terms of spatiality or extension, right? So we can't, strictly speaking, say that the soul is in anything or is really anywhere at all, because to place the soul somewhere would be then to identify it as occupying some determinate measure of space, which would then be to say it's physical. But that's precisely what we've denied, right? So then the question remains open. How is it the soul and the body can relate in any significant way, much stronger, as Descartes admits, than the relationship between, say, a sailor and a ship, or between you and your car? There appears to be this fundamental ambiguity when we think of the connection between mind and body. That is, yeah, Descartes seems right in some way. I mean, when I think about myself, it seems like I can think about myself in ways that outstrip the physical limits of my body, right? And so I can imagine, for example, putting my consciousness into a robot or something. I can conceive of that. But then at the same time, my body isn't just some indifferent thing that I don't give a shit about. Like, I can't just get a new body, and I wouldn't even really want to, right? It's my body. And when I say that, maybe what I really mean, it's me. So in some sense, beyond thinking that I have a body, I am brought to consider that I am a body. But then for the reason I just mentioned, that's not entirely satisfying, because I think I'm somehow beyond my body. So I think that this is what's most interesting about Descartes, is despite his confidence in laying out in stark logical terms this fundamental difference between mind and body, he still can't grapple with that difference to its logical conclusion, right? So does that make sense?
Can I get some quick clarification real quick?
Yeah, sure.
Can you go back to the last slide, actually? The last claim, when he said that the mind and body are separate substances, I think it was, is that him claiming that identity does not come with the mind?
Let me pull it back up. So which one were you talking about?
Premise 5, or at least the conclusion there. Is he saying there that the mind is not how you identify a person? Or
No, so he still wants to hold on to the claim that mind in this instance, so in this particular sentence, as in the other sentences that make up the argument, mind is identical with the I as the pronoun
Oh, okay.
which one would refer to oneself, whereas the body is not. But again, he even says, though, as I mentioned, that however different the body might be and distinct from oneself as a mind, it's still not entirely indifferent. It's not some neutral thing. And so that's the ambiguity I was talking about. But he still really strongly holds on to the notion that selfhood or I-ness or personal identity is precisely the mind. And for him, of course, from a more theistic starting point, that is also interchangeable with notions like the soul, as we've been talking about. And so this is why Hume talks about the philosophical concept of the soul that some philosophers like Descartes appeal to, as necessarily simple and identical, that is self-identical over time. And so some students, and you might think, well, why do we have to think that soul is simple and identical? Maybe we can have a different understanding of soul, which many cultures do, right? So we're really only dealing with this kind of Western notion of the soul. But for example, the certain indigenous tribes like the Shoshone, or I think even, I could be incorrect about this, some might know, but the Blackfoot Indians, there's this idea of multiple souls. So there's the soul that animates our waking consciousness and our living bodies, but then there's a soul that's capable of wandering about at night when we dream, and perhaps even visiting the land of the dead and coming back. But here we're dealing specifically with this Cartesian sort of Western concept of the soul. And that's why we're using it as a point to consider different ways of thinking personal identity. Because if we think that maybe we have multiple souls, well, that just confuses even more the idea of personal identity. Because you might think, well, what the hell is this spooky night soul doing? Like, is that me or is that something else? I don't know. But does that make sense? Well,
Yeah, perfect sense. Thank you.
all right. So any, Fia, I just saw you said, I believe the moon is cheese. What kind of cheese do you think it would be? You don't have to answer that. Pepper jack, okay, that's good. Swiss is the usual answer, I guess, because of the craters and pockmarks. But yeah, pepper jack, I like that. Cool. So are there any final questions or comments about Descartes before we take a break, and then we'll transition to Hume? No? All right, cool. So let's just take like a 5-minute break. We'll come back and first we'll look at the existential comic on offer for this week, putting Hume and Avicenna together. And then is anyone a fan or at least a viewer of the show Westworld? Has anybody seen that? Cool, it's a really fantastic sci-fi series on HBO, and there's a particular episode in which the characters, without naming him, articulate really nicely this Humean no-self view. So there's like a 2-minute YouTube video I have pulled up to watch from that series. Okay, so let's take just a little bit of a break, and then we'll come back and talk about Hume. On here. Okay, so let's get started again. So I'm gonna share the screen first. Where is it? Oh, here it is. First, to show the Hume and Avicenna comic. Maybe some of you already read it, but it'll be fun to just look at it together. Okay, so this is a great comic because, as I mentioned in the description of it on Moodle, where I embedded it during or for week 4, is that it demonstrates that two philosophers, in this case, one from the 11th century and another from the 18th century, one from the Islamic world, one from Europe and Scotland in particular, they arrive at radically different conclusions, right? So this is very interesting. If you recall the floating man thought experiment from last week, which basically suggests if a human being were to emerge into conscious awareness all at once, suddenly, in a dark vacuum, with no sensory contact, that is, not even able to feel other parts of one's own body, one would still know something. That is to say, one's own being, one's own self. But Hume, as a radical empiricist, as we'll see, challenges that. Okay, so let's just take some time to read through these panels. All right.
That's really funny.
So where do you guys stand on that? Who do you think is right, Hume or Avicenna?
I go back and forth.
Yeah, I mean, if there's nothing to experience, that is, no content of one's observable experience or observing experience, I should say, well then, what is the experience?
I was just about to say that it's kind of like disproving itself, similar to the other thing we were talking about. If he can say that there is an experience, there is something to experience it. But like it disproves that there would be no experience.
You got some smooth jams going there. Appreciate that. Yeah.
So I actually
I'm
agree
in
with
my
Hume.
art studio right now. I'm
Oh,
sorry.
cool.
So I agree with Hume quite a bit in this. But as I was sitting here thinking about it, it gave me an idea to expand on Avenici's idea. So say a person, and this has happened, was born blind and deaf. You know, they can't see and they can't hear. You know, they're obviously still experiencing. Perhaps you could say, well, they're feeling, but in the end, they're still like they're there. They know they're there. So is that an argument for the soul? I personally don't agree with the idea of a soul. And like I said, in general, I agree with Hume's that if you just were there with nothing, what is there are we. But then I come to the idea that are we totally reliant on our sight and our hearing, our sensations to have us be a person, you know?
Yeah, so I mean, you're right that, you know, many people have been born or through various traumatic events have been rendered insensate in particular senses. So sight and hearing, for example. But as you pointed out, there would still be other sense modalities at play, more subtle and perhaps more important ones. So the sense of touch, that is the tactile sense, olfaction, right, the sense of smell. There would still be presumably the gustatory sense, the sense of taste. And then also one sense modality that's typically neglected in these kind of simple conversations about sense experience, that of proprioception, which is this kind of kinesthetic awareness of one's own bodily place and relationship to an environment, right? So right now I have this proprioceptive awareness of where my body stands with respect to the wall behind me, right? So this prevents you from, as an overall self-awareness of where you are in the world, from like bumping into shit all the time, right? So maybe that's, as a more subtle, but in any case more significant sense, sufficient to ground oneself in some experienceable content. And so this is a point made by 20th century phenomenologists. Phenomenology is an important school of European thought, which would give rise to existentialism. But Husserl, for example, the founder of phenomenology, argued a point which might seem fairly obvious, but it's quite powerful and far-reaching in its implications. And it is that consciousness is always consciousness of something. And that's what we call, in phenomenology, intentionality. So my consciousness is always conscious of an object, and the character of that of, that is, which brings my consciousness into connection with whatever I'm conscious of, plays out in different ways. So I can be conscious of my cell phone, for example, perceptually. So the of has the intentional character of visual perception. Or I can be conscious of my cell phone by a memory, if I'm just remembering, if I'm trying to remember where I put it last, if I'm looking for it. Well, there the of that relates me, my consciousness that is, to the cell phone is one of memory recall or image or something like that. But consciousness is always of something. And what would it mean then to be conscious of yourself? And this is Hume's problem, right? What would it mean to be conscious of yourself, this thing we call the self that is purified from any qualifying aspect of the environment in which it finds itself? So that's what Hume means when he says, whenever I try to think about myself, this is on page 132, right? The very first page, he says, for my part, when I look inward at what I call myself, I always stumble upon some particular perception of heat or cold, light or shade, love or hatred, pain or pleasure. I never catch myself without a perception. So whenever you try to think of yourself, it's always self in a qualified sense. So right now I find myself a little bit hungry, a little bit tired, with a particular taste of coffee in my mouth, with the hum of the heating unit, with the light that's entering from the window, and so forth. Where is this self that's distinct from all of these qualitative aspects of the environment in which it is manifest? Does that make sense?
Wait, so do our emotions count as like perceptions?
Yeah, we're going to talk about that. So when Hume uses the language of impression or perception, a part of that would be our emotions, our feeling, our sentiment. And Hume understands that to be an inward perception, whereas the perception that we usually identify with that word, something like sensory observation of the external environment, he calls that outward sense or outward sense experience or impressions. And so, yeah, we'll talk more in detail about impressions. And again, or in a couple of weeks, actually, we'll return to Hume in connection to or in confronting a different problem that's related to this. So we'll be reading Hume twice, just like we're reading Plato twice. So after the midterm, we'll go back to Plato, specifically the Allegory of the Cave from the Republic, and then we'll return to Hume after that. Okay, so any other comments or questions so far?
Can I say something?
Yeah, of course.
So there's this thing called sensory deprivation tanks, and it's also in Stranger Things. And you like float in water and all of your senses are cut off, and people who do that tend to report like hallucinations and enhanced creativity. And I think that's like very similar to the floating man
Hmm.
thing.
Yeah,
So,
that's really interesting.
about
Have
that.
you experienced that, Ashley, or anybody else?
No.
Has anyone, I haven't. I've been
friend of
curious.
mine, a friend of mine actually travels the states in his van, and he did one of those, I think in Colorado, I believe. He and a couple of his buddies went through that, and he said the same thing. He's a metal worker type of artist, and he told me like that he was kind of he said it was similar to like a psilocybin experience, in the sense of like it being really like stimulating to the mind, but not so much so that like he was overwhelmed. And he just said that like he did a lot of like introspection, and obviously not going to get into specifics because it's his life, but kind of very like abstract, very I don't know how to explain it, but that's an interesting point to bring up, because I was thinking the same thing. Like we can still experience in situations of sensory deprivation.
Yeah, and so you pointed out, both of you, in your comments, a kind of effect of heightening of, if not just thoughts or thinking or ideas, even on a psychedelic register, then even heightened sensation. And so actually, so as a musical artist, and I have a musical project with a professor of Spanish, Enrique Chacon, some of you might know him, but we've, oh, so you know him, Liam? Yeah, he's one of my good friends, and we have this project that we've had ongoing for a few years, and we've performed at SOU a couple times. Last year, we put on an event at the Black Box Gallery called Dark Adaptation, and the audience had to sit in the, for those familiar with the space, it's really really unique and interesting, and particularly um, um, particularly disposed to this kind of thing, because it's all black, right, from floor to ceiling, and there's no sort of opening for light. We closed off all of the points of light to make it perfectly dark, and then we performed music from behind the curtain. And so the audience was deprived of any sort of visual effect. They couldn't even see their hands like before their face. That was the idea, at least. And so it opened up a new relationship to the sound, right? So if your visual access or exposure or perception is reduced or eliminated, well, then your other sense modalities can be heightened. But then something like the sensory deprivation chamber, I haven't done it myself, but I would suspect, and I would be curious about this, I suspect that it wouldn't remove entirely that sense of touch. So there would still, even if you move a little bit, I don't really know exactly the setup, but you would still feel contact between your body and the water, even if the temperature of the water is brought to a specific level such to reduce that sense of separation or difference. It'd still be there a little bit. But then, like when you guys talked about something approximating even psychedelic experiences, you still have the content of your thinking, which, unlike the floating man, who was, remember, just spontaneously birthed in a vacuum out of nothing, you still can rely on your own past experience, which would play into your consciousness at that moment. Does that make sense? So then you would still have ideas or thoughts that have been brought to the surface of your awareness from your past experience, which is in some sense, of course, physical or bodily or sensory. And so it's a situation or an experiment which comes close maybe to the conditions of the floating man, but not entirely. In fact, it would seem to be impossible to really put ourselves in an experimental situation to test Avicenna's conclusion on that, right? Because you would have to render the subject completely oblivious, right? So then you might not even have language. So then it's hard to even think of what the experience of thinking would be like, right? But does that make sense?
Yeah, I have something to add.
Sure.
So with like the sensory deprivation tanks, it's like full of salt water, and like eventually you kind of just grow numb. Like you don't feel the fact that you're on the water, and you don't move a whole lot. You don't like bob. So um, it's kind of like if you have like a bracelet on your skin after a while, you stop feeling that you have a bracelet
Hmm.
just because there's that constant contact. And one thing too that I know that works is you can like put white noise in like earbuds, put your earbuds in, lay back and have like a white sheet of paper in like a really bright room over your eyes. So the only thing you see is like white, and then you just keep your eyes open, and that does work
I'm gonna try that.
strangely well. Yeah. You kind of just lay there, and it took 5 minutes, something like that, before anything started happening. Um, there was like little creatures crawling around in me, and they were like all my cells and stuff. And there was like people talking to me. It was really weird.
Wow. That sounds
Yeah, and it's not like you just need paper and headphones. It's better to do it with earbuds because you don't want like the top part of a headset to kind of like interfere, make more contact than needed to be. But if you kind of lay in like a bed, you stop feeling the bed after a while
yeah.
because you don't move at all and you just lay flat on your back.
That's interesting. So when it comes to the sensory deprivation chambers, are you wearing like water wings or something? Like how are you, does anyone know how you're actually suspended in the water?
It's really salty water.
Oh,
So with my friend, how it was he crawled into this like metal tank, and he was strapped in around the waist at first, but then he said that like he didn't notice it come off, but like at some point it came off, and he was just kind of floating in it.
oh, okay, cool. Yeah, that's really interesting. All right, so yeah, so we'll continue now with Hume, and I want to show that brief video. So it's just like under 2 minutes or so from the show Westworld. So there could be some spoilers in here if those, for those who haven't seen the show and are interested in doing so. But it's an excellent, very philosophically oriented um, series, and specifically philosophically in the sense that we've been grappling with so far in connection to questions pertaining to personal identity and consciousness and so forth. But the basic idea of the show, for those who don't know, and it's actually based on an older, not very good film starring Yul Brynner. The show is much better, but there's like an amusement park that these engineers create, where the so-called hosts are these androids, these kind of robotic figures that are uncannily made to be, in terms of the experience of the guest, as real, that is, as human-like as possible. But this particular amusement park is set in the Wild West, right? So that you can go and experience being a gunslinger or something like that. But in the scene I'm going to show you, the creator of the park is talking to one of the engineers, so one of the producers. But the question is very interesting. We have this kind of conceit along Cartesian lines, for example, that what distinguishes us even from potentially artificially intelligent beings that smart human engineers could create and reproduce is that we are special in some way. We have a soul. And that's what gets turned around and undermined and posed in different ways as a problem or question in the series. So I'm going to pull it up here. And I forgot to do this with my class, my ethics class yesterday, that I also record. And on YouTube, it was blocked for copyright reasons because I showed some video. So I have to pause the record, resume the recording. So hopefully that made some sense in the context of having read Hume. Does anyone have any comments or questions about that?
I've never seen the show, but it's really interesting that they gave them backstories, but not just that they give them backstories, that they gave them slightly tragic. Like that guy seemed like he had a tragic backstory. That's interesting. Seems like an interesting.
Yeah, it's influenced that feature of the show and many others, by the way, by the groundbreaking sci-fi film by Ridley Scott from 1982, Blade Runner. Some of you might have seen that, or at least I think, kind of shitty sequel that came out a few years ago. But the replicants in that show, the androids, were given along Lockean lines false memories, right? And that turned out to constitute the strong basis for their sense of self or personhood. So I set this slideshow up, last time I taught the class, and I did a little bit differently where we discussed Buddhism first. So I'm going to skip over the first slide, and maybe we can come back to that next time, but we have some presenters. I think Mozu is one of them, and I can't recall who so are you guys here, whoever is presenting this week?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, yeah, so
It's me, Robin, and Abraham. Yeah.
Yeah, Mozu, Robin, and Abraham. Okay, cool. Yeah, so you guys are tasked specifically with talking about the readings for Thursday, but you can, of course, extend that, as I've mentioned, to touch on Hume as well. So I wanted to, hold off on the discussion of Buddhism until Thursday. And we have just a couple very short readings. So there's the famous Heart Sutra, which is quite short, and then a chapter from one of Thich Nhat Hanh's books for next class. So we'll just spend some time clarifying Hume here. So here's a passage from page 132, from the very first page. But just to say a couple things about Hume's project, and I'll provide more details about this and give a more concrete account when we return to Hume, because here we're really focused on the no-self view in particular. But Hume, as a radical empiricist, who as an empiricist was much more radical, in that sense much more controversial than his predecessors, John Locke and Bishop George Berkeley. We'll talk about them once we get back to Hume again. But he operated on the basis of a profound skepticism, and we've already encountered skepticism so far, but the skepticism that Hume leverages and operates within is of a different character altogether than what we saw in terms of the methodological skepticism associated with Descartes. Because remember, what defines Cartesian skepticism is the assumption of epistemological foundationalism. That is, that there is some bedrock that would stand as the ultimate and justificatory ground for anything we could possibly know, to be certain. Hume, in his skepticism, is very much closer to those ancient Pyrrhonian skeptics, where the real goal of the skepticism is to remain in a state of kind of, the Greek word is isothenia, where you have to actively combat or press back against our tendency to fall into some acceptance of truth, because there's always a problem with the concluding truth that we seem to arrive at. And so in order to avoid anxiety and disappointment of being wrong when we make firm judgments, the ancient skeptics, very similar to Hume, maintain the necessity for tranquility, for peace of mind, for psychological harmony, to avoid committing ourselves to any strong conclusion. And specifically, Hume performs these moves in connection to three important phenomena, one of which we're dealing with this week: identity or selfhood. He is also skeptical of, as we'll see next time, and it's related to this problem, that is a problem of selfhood or personal identity, cause and effect, causation. So he's very skeptical of our sort of naive or pre-reflective understanding of cause and effect. And then he's also skeptical of, and this sounds crazier and more significant than it is really, He's also skeptical of the external world, the existence of external reality, which might make it seem that he is a metaphysical idealist. As we'll see in a couple weeks when we come back to this, the Irish philosopher and theologian Bishop Berkeley was a major idealist, and idealists hold that everything that exists is simply an idea in some mind or consciousness. But that is actually not where Hume goes. In fact, his move is perhaps more radical than that. It's to just foreclose metaphysical questions altogether. So this is a radicalization of the epistemological turn that happens in the 17th century, where in this Western tradition, we start to move away from metaphysical questions and problems and focus very narrowly on epistemological ones. That is, instead of trying to know what the basic nature of reality is, we should focus more on what we can possibly know and understand ourselves, given our imperfections. And so Hume would say, well, in his skepticism of the external world, how does he arrive at that skepticism? Well, all that we have access to in our experience are impressions, right? So I have a tactile impression of the phone in my hand. I have a visual impression of the tree out the window. I have an auditory impression of the hum of the heater. These are all impressions, and I tend to infer naturally that there is some substance, there is some mind-independent object beneath these impressions, making them possible, but I never have access to them. All I have are my impressions. So Hume doesn't say that there is no mind-independent reality, which means he's not a strict idealist. He just says, we can't know it, and it doesn't fucking matter anyway. All we have is our impressions, and that's really all we can talk about. And he does the same with respect to the supposed impression that all of us have of ourselves or of existing as some self-same personal identity. And so we can just read this passage. So this is the argument for identity. And so this is the very argument that Hume is going to contest. He's going to challenge, endeavor to refute. So just to read it, we are every moment intimately conscious of what we call our self. We feel its existence and its continuing to exist, and are certain, more even than any demonstration could make us, both of its perfect identity and of its simplicity. So simplicity just meaning that it's irreducible beyond its singular essential presence. That is to say, beyond the various qualities that I attach to the experience of being a self, such as what I see, what I hear, what I smell, what I feel as emotions, there is some singular thing that remains unchanged and can hold or make possible all these differing characteristics. So that's what's meant by this idea of simplicity. The strongest sensations and most violent emotions, instead of distracting us from this view of ourself, only focus it all the more intensely, making us think about how these sensations and emotions affect ourself by bringing it pain or pleasure. To offer further evidence of the existence of oneself would make it less evident. So now imagine Miller, back to the Perry dialogue, talking to Professor Weyrob, who says, well, how do I know that I'm even the same self now that I was before? Last week when we had dinner at this restaurant. Miller is like, well, if you don't even know who you are now, what the hell can I possibly tell you in this conversation? So that's kind of what Hume is articulating here. To try to argue that you are yourself would make it less evident, not more, because no fact we could use as evidence is as intimately present to our consciousness as is the existence of our self. If we doubt the latter, again, echoing Miller, that character, we can't be certain of anything, right? So that is the typical philosophical view to which Hume is critically responding, right? So that's the conceit that he's going to argue against. And so here's how he does it. So I've distilled the argument similarly to how I did Descartes from the second and sixth meditations. So premise one, all ideas are ultimately derived from impressions. And in the next slides, if you'll hold on just a moment, I'll unpack more carefully what Hume means by these terms, specifically impressions and idea and so forth. Premise two, so the idea of a persisting self is ultimately derived from impressions. But no impression is a persisting thing. Therefore, there cannot be any persisting idea of self. So that's the conclusion. In summary, because the self must be, as we've seen, by this sort of the lights of this Western intellectual tradition at least, because the self must be a constant, persisting, stable thing, and yet all knowledge is derived from impressions, and that's Hume's empiricism, right? So an empiricist says that all knowledge is ultimately derived from sense experience. And that's in contrast to a rationalist, such as Descartes, for example, who, remember, says that sense experience is rather like an obstacle that stands in the way of legitimate knowledge or certainty. Hume is an empiricist, right? He thinks that knowledge comes from sense experience, without which no experience, and hence, so that is without sensation, no experience, and hence no knowledge. And knowledge is always populated or made up of ideas would be possible. So because the self must be a constant, persisting, stable thing, and yet all knowledge is derived from impressions, which are transient, so constantly moving, non-persisting, variable things, it follows that we don't really have knowledge of a self. Thus, we don't have knowledge of a self because there is no self. Or perhaps a little weaker than that, his major claim is that we should at least be skeptical that there is this thing that philosophers have called the self. So does the argument make sense? And by the way, this argument, and perhaps this was confusing, or maybe it was fairly clear in the reading, but it's an argument against identity as such, not specifically or only personal identity in the Lockean sense of one's identity as a person. So the identity attached to personhood or selfhood in that kind of human sense. He denies the reality of identity at all, even for inanimate objects. So like a vegetable, he uses the example of a vegetable. So if you have, like an onion or something like that sitting on your shelf, when you go to bed at night, you wake up the next morning, you say, oh yeah, that's the same onion. But in fact, he denies that. It's not the same thing. There's no persisting identity for any phenomenon, whatever. It's all a kind of illusion.
Wait, so how does Descartes' I think, therefore I am type of thing fit into this?
Well, we can be a little bit critical of that. So Immanuel Kant, for example, and we'll talk a little bit about Kant, perhaps not today, but on Thursday, because Kant gives us a good critical response to Hume, I think. But Kant is a notoriously difficult and painful writer, so I'm not in this intro class going to ask you to read Kant. But in response to Descartes, Kant said that Descartes' phenomenological argument, that is to say, he has this conceit of beginning without any assumptions, right? So that's what we saw in the first meditation. He's going to try to achieve knowledge or certainty, or to figure out what we can know with certainty, without relying on any presuppositions at all, derived either from his past experience or from what he's been taught in school or from his parents and other familiars. Yet Kant points out that he doesn't really do that entirely. So go back to the cogito, the I think, therefore I am. the fact that I can think that I might be actively deceived by some powerful force in terms of the content of what I claim or otherwise expect to know, shows that because I am deceived, there must at least be an existing thing that is deceived. Kant says, well, hold on, Descartes. By this move, by this logic, you can demonstrate perhaps quite powerfully that there is thinking happening, right? Because if doubt is a version or a species of thinking, so to doubt is more generally to think, then Descartes is right that he's demonstrating the reality of thinking as an active process. But it's another move altogether to say that because there's thinking, there must be some substance, there must be some object, there must be some thing that we label I or self that is carrying out the project of thinking, right? Does that make sense? So Hume might say the same thing. Sure, there is this activity, there is this process unfolding, but that doesn't mean that there is any ground or self-same source of substance that is unfolding the process or sustaining it or making it possible. So then the idea of self could be an illusion that, and this is really how Hume ends up concluding, the idea that we have of self is brought about or caused in some weird way by this kind of subjective experience of thought or thinking. And it's not necessarily the case that there is any such object. And Hume's proof for that, that we should at least be skeptical of it, is we never find it. So if I asked, so if Hume said, you know, think about yourself, find the self, find it right now, think about it. He would say in the next move, in the next breath, you can't. You can't find it, because the moment you do, you think about yourself, like I was saying earlier, qualified. So I think about myself sitting in a chair, the taste of coffee in my mouth, the smell of, you know, old building, probably lead paint chipping off the walls or something like that. Does that make sense? I mean, that's a really good question, by the way, but does that help?
Yeah, so like what Hume's saying is like there's no way to prove that we exist, right?
Yeah, well, yeah, so we can talk about the existence, if you want, of impressions. So when I say there's a cell phone here, all that really means is I have a cell phone in my hand. That is to say, I have an impression of the cell phone. But when I use the word I there, I'm using it grammatically, really, in a kind of reflexive sense. It doesn't necessarily have to attach to anything that remains stable and unchanging. It could be a kind of process. And that's actually how later thinkers would approach the problem. Existentialists like Kierkegaard, for example, the Danish philosopher who notoriously in this kind of tortured, very complex prose said, the self is a self-relating relation. So, you know, chew on that for a little bit. The self is a self-relating relation. So it's not anything, and it's not the relation either. It's the relation relating to itself as a relation. So there's no bottom to the process of relationship, in other words. I mean, that's probably confusing, and to really unpack the Kierkegaardian point would take more time, but does that make some sense? Oh, okay, cool. Perfect. All right, so what then are impressions and ideas? So clarifying this will help us to understand the argument that we just worked through a little better. So according to Hume's empiricism, all knowledge, and this is in concert with all empiricists. So it's not unique to Hume so far, but all knowledge is reducible to or derived ultimately from sense experience. And so according to Hume, we only know things insofar as the content or objects of our knowledge have in some way been taken up in time through our experience in navigating the world. And so very provocatively, earlier in this text, so this is the Treatise on Human Nature, he makes this point. He says, look, go to the library, and this is to give you a sense of the radical nature of his empiricism. He says, go to the library, grab any book you want off the shelf, open it up, and whatever claims or purported knowledge that you find in this book, try to see if, at least in principle, you can trace it back to some possible sense experience. Obviously not your own, but at least somebody else's. And if you can't trace this idea back, in principle at least, to some sense experience, well then he says, you might as well throw that book in the fire, because it's just a bunch of bullshit. It's nonsense. And so that might apply, and this, at least threatened at the time, we're talking about the 18th century here, to get Hume into some hot water. Think about God in that sense, right? So I have the idea of God. Hume would ask, where did that idea come from? When have you ever had a sense impression of God? Well, if you haven't, well, then that idea is illusory and it's been produced from other sources. What sources? Well, ourselves. Hume says, well, what is God? God is, first of all, a being that has perfect power. Well, thinking of my own self, I have some power. I can do some things. I just take that idea and exaggerate it to the extreme limit. Or knowledge, God has perfect knowledge. Well, I know some things. So again, I just exaggerate in my own case to its limit, and now I have omniscience and so forth. Every idea has, in principle, to be traced back to some originary sense impression, and all impressions are either of an outward nature or an inward nature. So outward impressions are what we call sense perception or sensation. So right now, I have an outward impression of a tactile character of the coffee cup in my hand. I feel its smooth surface with my skin, which is producing the auditory impression that it generates when I do that for my ears. And then I have the visual impression and so forth. Now, for Hume, as a strict empiricist, and this is what we call in the literature sense data theory, every aspect of my sensory experience is actually made up of these discrete qualia, is the technical terminology. And so that's plural. So I have the qualia of the visual impression, the tactile impression, the auditory impression, the olfactory impression, and so forth. And then what the mind does is it tends to project a kind of uniform smoothness over the distinctness of these qualia to make them seem to be uniform or connected in some essential or integral way. But really, they're all almost like in painting practices, like Impressionism, for example, the practice of pointillism, or like a mosaic or something like that, where if you stand far enough away, it appears to be a more or less uniform image, but that image in its unity resolves into discrete points when you get closer to it. That's how Hume thought about our experience of reality. And then we have these inward impressions, which would be sentiment or emotional feeling. And often these can bear, these outward and inward senses can bear an important relationship to each other. So if you go to the airport, for instance, to pick up a long lost loved one whom you haven't seen in a while, when you perceive them walking out from the airport, you have a visual impression of them as an object out in the world. And this gives rise to an inward sentiment of happiness or love when you see them. And then ideas that we have, which make up knowledge as such, are actually simply copies of these original sense impressions. So consider this image of what appears to have happened when an object was dropped into this pool of water, right? So think of when you like throw a rock into a pond and it strikes the surface of the water. So that moment of contact between the stone and the water is like the originary impression. And then the radiating concentric circles that spread out from that center, and then they progressively decay, as you can see here, until they disappear altogether. Those are ideas in this metaphor. So that one idea would be like an idea of memory. But the farther away the memory is from the original impression or experience, the more faint or less powerful it will be, until perhaps you lose it altogether. So ideas are like that. They are like less vigorous or forceful copies of original sense impressions. So that means there can be no ideas without some impression that came either from outward experience and perception or inward sentiment and feeling. Okay, so we're almost out of time, but we'll pick up on this next time. But this is the last thing we'll comment on. So this is a part of the text on page 133 that gives us Hume's famous bundle theory of the self. That is, what we call the self is really just a loosely coherent and not even logically coherent necessarily bundle of sensations. So he says, setting aside metaphysicians of this kind, and here he's referring to metaphysicians like Descartes, who think that there is some unified and simple self. He says, I'm willing to affirm of the rest of mankind that each of us is nothing but a bundle or collection of different perceptions that follow each other enormously quickly and are in a perpetual flux and movement. Our eyes can't turn in their sockets without varying our perceptions. So if I even turn my eyes or blink my eyes, I am actually generating new impressions. Our thought is even more variable than our sight, and all our other senses and faculties contribute to this change in our perceptions, with no one of them remaining unaltered for a moment. The mind is a kind of stage on which many perceptions successfully make their appearance. They pass back and forth, glide away, and mingle in an infinite variety of positions and situations. Strictly speaking, there is no simplicity in the mind at one time, and no identity through different times, no matter what natural inclination we may have to imagine that simplicity and identity. Okay, so then the next question is, if self is an illusion, that is an illusory idea, how does this illusion arise in the first place? And so Hume, on that basis, gives us a kind of psychological account, which we'll turn to next time before getting into the discussion of Buddhism through our presenters. Okay, but so we're out of time. Are there any final questions or comments before we go?
Could you say what simplicity was again?
Yeah, so simplicity would be the idea that if there is a self that is the necessary bearer of all of the content of my experiences, and that self remains itself, that is substantially unchanged by the character of those experiences, then I should be able to distinguish the self, that is, simplify the self. I should be able to find the self, pull it away from all of those particular experiences that might qualify it and say, here is the self, and here's the way it experiences the world. But Hume's argument is we never find this simplicity in our experience. There is no bare, pure self that can be isolated from the qualitative differences of the way we navigate the world through our senses. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, thank you.
Okay, yeah, no problem. Any other questions? All right. Well, thanks for another fantastic discussion, guys. It was a really great session today, and I look forward to continuing it with you on Thursday and connecting it to Buddhism. So I hope you have a good week, and I'll see you in a couple days.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Arman.
See ya.